Few people in our world get more grief than weathermen, right? Or weather people, regardless of gender. They tend to catch a lot of grief because they're in a hard business, right? If it rains 4 inches across the road but doesn't rain at your house, you're going to think, well, that man's a liar because it didn't rain at my house, and you're going to give him grief. And so being a weather person is a hard thing. I came across this story of a young Indian boy that was given the task of ensuring that the entire village that he lived in had enough wood for the winter. And this was the first time he'd ever been given such an honor, and he wanted to do it right. And so before he went to work, he decided to call the weatherman to ask what kind of winter was to be expected. And so the weatherman told him it was going to be warm and an uneventful winter. And so the boy thought to himself, this is great. I won't have to work too hard, and I'll be able to look good in front of the whole tribe. So just to be safe, though, he gathered a few of his friends, and they went to work for a week. At the end of the week, after chopping and piling the wood, the boy decided to give the weatherman one last call before he put his axe away for the winter. The weatherman told him, instead of being nice and pleasant, it was going to be cold and very cold, and he should be prepared for that. So shocked at the sudden change in forecast and not wanting to disappoint his leaders of his village, he gathered more of his friends, and they went to work even more diligently. And for the next 2 weeks, they cut and they cut and they cut and they piled wood in preparation for what they thought was going to be a cold winter, according to the weatherman. Once again, the boy called the weatherman one more time, just to make sure before he put his axe away again. And this time, the weatherman told him, son, it is going to be a very bitter, cold, and long winter. Maybe the worst winter on record. And the exasperated boy just asked, well, what makes you say that, sir? And the weatherman replied, well, the Indians are gathering wood like crazy. So there are things in life that sometimes being a weatherman is hard, right? And they get all kinds of if you want a joke, to make a joke about a weatherman, and that will go well. But it is that time of year. Eventually, one of these days, it's going to turn from winter to summer. So they say. I don't know if it's going to happen, but eventually this time of year, it usually changes. And this time of year brings about with it lots of storms. And although we give weathermen lots and lots of grief, the first storm that comes, what are you going to do? You're going to turn your phone on, you're going to turn the radio on, you're going to turn your TV on, because even though we give them grief, they tend to save our lives when they tell us that a storm is coming and they prepare us for that. A storm is a terrible place to be caught in. It's uncomfortable and sometimes scary and maybe even life-threatening certain times. And so the physics and the science behind a storm is something that's interesting, and I think it has an application for what we want to look at here today. So I want to show you a not-so-exciting video that describes the process of how a storm comes to be. And so, kids, pay attention. This may be on your ACT test someday, so take a look if you would, please. Okay.
Well, thunderstorms are one of those phenomenon that is caused essentially by differences in temperature, differences in pressure, and so on. And the bigger the differences there are, the more severe those thunderstorms are. And essentially what you get is, in just about every case, a big gradient in temperature, which causes winds. All right, you get movement of air masses, and typically the movement is upwards, where you'll get big time heating of air, particularly near the ground. That hot, moist air, particularly in an area like this near the ocean, will begin to rise. If it is heated and it has a lot of moisture in it, the more heating, the more rising that you get. All right, as it rises, it begins to cool. It cools and condenses. You start getting cloud formation. Well, as you get more and more cooling, then you start getting droplets forming to form the rain. With more and more lift, all right, you get faster and faster cooling, condensation, and so on. Heavier rains, heavier winds, and then you start throwing in the electrical disturbances in the atmosphere caused by this rapid exchange of air masses. There's your lightning and thunder that come along, and as we said, the more that this occurs, the faster it occurs, and so on, the more intense your thunderstorms become.
All right. Are you enthralled and ready to do church now? All right. Very good. Well, the next time a storm happens, I hope that you will take precautions. But physical storms in the world of nature are not the only storms that you and I have to wrestle with. there are spiritual storms as well, faith storms that happen to us that sometimes are just as traumatic, so can be just as scary, maybe not as visible, but they are just as real on the inside of us. Max Lucado several years ago described doubt in this way, that clouds of doubt are created when the warm, moist air of our expectations meets the cold air of God's silence. Just like, did you know, everybody said storms, it's difference. There's two different things that are colliding. And in that difference, you find this storm that erupts. Well, doubt in your life is no different. There are expectations that you come with, that you have about God or people or something. There's expectations that are met then with cold reality. Maybe it's God's silence. And in the middle of that is a storm. And that storm produces anxiety. That storm causes us to question. That storm causes us to wonder, is God there? Is God real? And lots of people have been caught up in that storm, and they have made the conclusion, well, in the midst of my storm, I decided that either God wasn't there or God wasn't worth my efforts, and so they walk away from faith. Some people pretend there is no storm, and they just try to fake it and go through life and pretend that it's fine, but that really doesn't do you very well, because that just doesn't settle your heart. You're just faking it on the outside while your storm of doubt and struggles are going on inside of you, and that doesn't help you at all. And then there are some people who, in the midst of a storm, lean into the pain, lean into the struggle, and they may not ever find the answers they're looking for, they hope for. They may never really balance perfectly where was God in the midst of my storm, and yet they come through the storm stronger, more equipped, more at peace with God for some reason. And so today I want us to talk about those storms. And we're going to start over the next few weeks. Well, there's a word we're going to use to describe this series. It's called disillusioned. The word disillusioned, you've all experienced it. We all have, right? And it simply means this. It's disappointment in someone or something that one discovers to be less good than one had believed. And I think about faith, and I think, man, how many people end up there with God? I thought God was, my expectations, life happens this way, and there's this thing in the middle that God didn't seem to do, and God seems less good than I believed him to be. And there's a storm of doubt. And so in that equation, something has to be adjusted if we're going to find peace. And so today, we're going to start looking at just this whole disillusionment with God. In the weeks to come, we're going to look at things like being disillusioned with the church and with people and with pain and all kinds of things that sometimes cause us to go to a place of disillusionment. And I hope this will be helpful for us. Because this week, at least for me, was a week that life was just kept raising things that were good illustrations of the need, of the struggle, of the storm that happens in our life. Maybe it's watching a chapter of life close in a way that you didn't think it would or hope it would. Maybe it's having to sit down with your child and talk about how their teacher has passed away. Maybe it's the hurt that you have for a friend who struggles and you don't know how to fix their hurt. Maybe it's the valued friendships or relationships that disappoint you. Maybe it's your struggle with your kids' decisions and just trying to think, I wish they would, but they won't. Maybe it's the stuff that promises happiness in your life but leaves you empty. But all of those things and dozens more lead us to a place where we have to think through it, feel through it, work through it. And the good news is that the Bible is not silent on this issue. In fact, the Bible I find to be a great source of guidance that helps us when we face that sense of disillusionment in our life. When we feel like I just don't know what I find, at least the Bible may not give me specific answers, but it encourages me along the path. And so I want to look at a story here in a moment that kind of picks up where we left off last week after Easter. But I want to read a couple of verses because I think the most poignant place I could point you to say, when you feel disillusioned, I would just point you to Jesus. Last weekend was Easter, and Good Friday was a part of that, of course. And so when you think of Friday, the crucifixion, a lot of things come to your mind about what you would see as you picture the cross. but maybe it's what you hear as you listen to the cross, where Jesus says these words in Psalm 22, or from Psalm 22. It says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Those are powerful words. Those are words of disillusionment. God, you've left. I don't know where you are, and it hurts really, really bad right now. But I'm thankful as I read those words that Jesus didn't invent those words. Jesus was quoting a psalm from 900, 1,000 years before that was written by a man just like you and me, who was wrestling with the sense of disillusionment because of the pain and the hurt and the sense of persecution that he was feeling in his life. And he wrote Psalm 22, where Jesus would later then on the cross quote and cry out to God, use David's words to cry out and express his anguish, his sense of disillusionment in the moment, to say, God, where are you in the midst of this? And I'm thankful that David said it before, because I'm glad Jesus said it. That comforts me to know that Jesus felt that. But man, David said it, and if you read the rest of that psalm, what you find is a man that is wrestling and is hurting and needs help, and he doesn't seem to be finding it. The Message version of that passage says this: God, my God, why did you dump me miles from nowhere? Doubled up with pain, I called to God all the day long, and no answer, nothing. I keep at it all night, tossing and turning. And he's disillusioned. So maybe you've been there, but David wasn't the only person. John the Baptist did it as well. John, as you read in the early parts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John the Baptist shows up, and he is this fierce, confident, bold preacher of Jesus Christ, that Jesus is the Messiah, that this is the guy we've been waiting for. And he stands before friends and enemies all and says, this is the Messiah, and may he increase and may I decrease. May I just take a back page and may he rise. And yet, the same fierce, bold man, just a few years into the process, as you read Matthew 11, you find that he sends a message to Jesus because he can't go there himself now, because his life circumstances have changed. No longer is he standing at the river preaching and baptizing. Now he is locked up. And fear and worry and disillusionment seem to be leading his mind when it says this in Matthew 11, when John, who was in prison now, imprisoned for preaching against the king and a wife that he shouldn't have had, he thought, and so he preached against that and got thrown in jail, and any day now they're going to chop his head off. Things are not what they once were. Expectations versus the silence of God and is at work in his life, and there's this storm that seems to be producing doubt, and so he asked the question, Are you really the one that we were expecting? And part of his implied question is, I'm having doubts if you are. Because I thought by now these things would have happened, expectations. But now you're not doing these things. And more importantly, I'm stuck in a painful, scary place. And I don't get it. And so, from David to John the Baptist, to Abraham, to Moses, to the disciples, to Paul, to Peter, just read through your story, and what you find is that Jesus has a way of not dealing with us based upon our expectations. What you find Jesus doing oftentimes is tearing down expectations so that he can rebuild faith. And so what I want us to think about this morning is simply two things. That sometimes our faith needs to be knocked down. And I don't mean that to be cold. I don't mean that to be calloused or hard. But I think it's biblical. That oftentimes our faith gets fixed on the wrong thing. Maybe it's an incomplete picture of who God is, an incomplete picture of Jesus. Maybe it's this idea of, well, I've just got my own agenda and my expectations for what God should be doing are based upon my expectations for what I want for my life. And God has a tendency to knock those down. And that's painful, right? If you ever get knocked down, it's never a pleasant thing, right? I played basketball for the first time like 7 years yesterday. My major fear was falling and breaking my hip, okay? I didn't care. I made a couple baskets along the way, but just, God, don't help me end up in the nursing home after I'm done today. That's all I want, okay? And so you realize that through life, getting knocked down is a painful thing. if you knock down walls, if you knock down things, all those reality shows always have the destruction mode, and those are fun to watch, but there's a sentimental attachment to some of the things that sometimes get torn away. And so sometimes God knocks down faith, knocks down an incomplete or a more shallow faith to rebuild something stronger on the other side. Now that process, though, as you know, hurts. It's scary and it's hard. But I want you to see that last week we looked at the first 12 verses of Luke 24, and as we did so, we kind of highlighted the Easter story, the witnesses and all those kinds of things, and how God was patiently developing faith step by step in the lives of these people. And I want to continue that story because I think what you see is a vivid picture of how Jesus takes two disciples who don't yet know that Jesus is alive, and he tears down an incomplete faith that they had so that he can rebuild a better one. And he uses the whole process of the crucifixion weekend to do that. And again, that's hard. That was a hard weekend for them. And some of you have had some hard things happen in your life, and maybe you'll identify with a little of this. Luke chapter 24, verse 13 says this. Now that same day, the same day that we read last week, that the ladies had gone to the tomb, found it empty, seen angels, come back, told the disciples, Peter and John, run to the tomb, found it empty. That same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus. Two other disciples, not the key ones who were staying in the upper room, but these are two disciples. Maybe they had come to Jerusalem, as many thousands had, for Passover weekend. It was a big holiday. It was a big travel weekend, and they're going back home. Like, Jesus is dead. What else we got to do here in Jerusalem? Let's go home. Let's go back. So they're traveling from Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem, or from Jerusalem to Emmaus, They were talking with each other about everything that had happened, just rehashing like you and I would, talking about a ball game we just seen or a concert we just gone to or a retreat or something we've been to. We talk about it. And so they're talking about everything they'd seen and heard. It goes on to say, as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. Now, this is a weird verse because why the blindness? Why not show who he is first? Because I think that illustrates the idea that Jesus needed to teach into this moment before it was done. And the best way for them to, like a good teacher who reinforces something, takes you around a couple winding roads, and all of a sudden, wham, here's the point I'm trying to make. That's what he does. So there's a blindness. They can't see who he is. So he asked them as it continues, what are you discussing together as you walk along? And they stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, are you the only dude in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's just happened here? All right, we were in town. Everybody knows what just happened. The big parade last Sunday when Jesus comes into town and the whole town's excited the Messiah is here, and then he goes in the temple and causes a scene and turns the tables, and everybody in town knew about that, and then this big crucifixion when everybody knew that Jesus died. Are you the only guy who doesn't know what's going on here? And so they rebuked Jesus in a way, and one of them named Cleopas asked him, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know these things are happening? What things? Jesus asked as it continues. What things? So Jesus is leading them. About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. And here's where you begin to see their faith in Jesus. They had expectations about who Jesus was going to be. Maybe they were more politically motivated and driven. Maybe they were motivations that, hey, when he comes into Jerusalem, finally these Romans are gone. Finally, we can get victory and relief and be our own people again. Finally, he has come to do these things. Their expectations, and as you keep reading, you find that Jesus begins to tear that down. Say, that's not why I've come. That's not what the Messiah has come to do. But he doesn't tear down for the sake of tearing down. He doesn't knock down something in your life for the sake of saying, you know what, I just want to hurt you. He tears down so that he might build back up. And so he was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. There's a statement of faith about him. The chief priests, though, and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. And here's the phrase, but we hoped, expectation, that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. We hoped. He surely had all the qualifications to do it. And what is more, it goes on to say, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us, and they went to the tomb early this morning but didn't find his body. And just like a student who is beginning to take pieces of information that has been given to them, and they're beginning to build it and put it together, and all of a sudden there's going to be this light bulb moment here, building here. They went to the tomb early this morning but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions, Peter and John, is who it was, went to the tomb and found it just as they had said, but they did not see Jesus. And then Jesus begins to speak to them. How foolish. And again, I don't think Jesus is being condescending or mean, but just how foolish. You ever call your kids foolish for doing something silly that they should have got, they didn't do it? You're not angry at them. You don't hate them. How foolish. Don't you get it? Don't you see what's going on here? How foolish you are and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And then beginning with Moses and the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. I would love to hear that conversation, just to listen to his teaching, to say, hey, here's all the stuff. Here's why you should think about this. But as they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over. And so he went in to stay with them. And then, here's the light bulb moment. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it. Exact same words as when he instituted communion just a few days before with his disciples and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. I wonder how he showed himself to them. I wonder if it was a miraculous thing. I wonder if it was the extending of hands with nail prints in them. I don't know how it was, but they saw. Like, oh my goodness, what are we seeing here? This is Jesus. This is Jesus. And he had torn down a faith that thought Jesus was just a prophet, just a Messiah, kind of wannabe who was going to come and free a group of people that would be forgotten in history. All of a sudden, Jesus is no longer just this guy who comes into town and defeats Romans. Now Jesus' faith is built. You see, an old faith was torn down so that a new faith could be built that is bigger, stronger. They had a bigger vision of who Jesus was. They knew him better. So because something better was built, that no longer is Jesus just about Romans. Jesus is about death. Man, Romans come and go, but death is permanent, right? No one comes back from the dead, but it's all different now. Everything is new because an old thing had been torn down, and now a new thing was wanting to be built. And so the story goes on. They rush back to Jerusalem, excited. I'm sure they ran back a lot faster than they walked out of town. Their heads are high. They're excited. They can't wait to get there and tell the disciples, we've seen him. An old thing was torn down so that a new thing could be built. And so Jesus allowed, even orchestrated, if you would, the destruction is the wrong word, the tearing down of an incomplete faith in the lives of his disciples so that a new one could be built. And he wanted greater faith in them. He wanted them to see something bigger, but it involved a process. It involved some difficult things. And so that leads us that Jesus isn't just about tearing down old things. Jesus is also about a faith that grows up. It's a faith that matures. It's a faith that's growing up as you deal with Jesus. And sometimes we have a tendency to hear about Jesus when we're young. A lot of us come to church and we learn about Jesus in a Sunday school class or from our families, our parents, and little church, and we're little. And the ways that we think about Jesus are very innocent and very good. They're fine. But as we grow, that faith has to grow too. I can't deal with a painful, hard world with my Sunday school faith of a little kid. I've got to grow. And Jesus sometimes has to tear down some of the old ways of thinking in order to build new and better into our life in the area of faith. And so if that's going to happen, there are just a couple of things I think that help in that process. And I wish there was an easy verse or an easy answer, an easy pill. They'll slip something in a communion wafer and it's all easy. But it doesn't work that way. It's a process. Faith is oftentimes a struggle. It's something we fight for, something we build over time. But that faith that grows, I think, at least has two elements, and one of them involves letting go. Letting go. I did that just so you'd have that Disney song stuck in your head the rest of the afternoon. But there's a letting go, right? There's a process that sometimes, just like the disciples, had to let go of the old version of Jesus that they believed in so that they could believe a new one. Sometimes God has to do that in our life too. Hey, let go of that way of thinking about me because there's this better way of thinking about me. And so when you think about this, Andy Stanley a couple of years ago did a sermon in which he kind of went through all of these gods that people walk away from their Christian faith because they don't believe in that God anymore. But really the God they're saying they believe in didn't ever exist in the beginning. It was just somebody told them that, or it was just an idea. And so I'll show you his list. There's others we could add to it. But I think the first two or three especially are relevant, that sometimes our expectations for what God is supposed to be is off because our expectations are wrong. The Bible never promised that or said that. But let me show you a few of them. The gods to go are the things like these. Maybe there's the bodyguard God. The bodyguard God, right? What's the bodyguard's job to do? Keep you safe, right? The God's job, number one job, is to make sure I'm safe. And if I'm not safe, if I'm not well, then God isn't doing his job. Now, where does that come from? Does that come from the Bible? Does that come from God's number one ultimate goal for you is to make you safe? You're not going to find that in the Bible. In fact, the very basis of Christianity is that the most perfect, good, righteous person had the most terrible, awful thing happen to him. And so through that, God did something really good. But when we think, well, I'm going to follow Jesus and I'm going to be safe, Jesus wasn't safe. His disciples, you look at the first century people that lived, were they safe? Read the book of Acts. No, they weren't safe. They died, a lot of them. They were persecuted, stoned, flogged, hated, rejected, run out of town. It wasn't safe. And so sometimes when we think, well, God, you aren't living up to your end of the deal because I'm not safe, maybe that's an expectation problem. And we need to tear that down so that I begin to build a faith that is richer and bigger. That disciples never prayed for safety necessarily. That wasn't their ultimate goal. I didn't ask for trouble. But if it came, they didn't just throw up their hands and say, well, this is too hard. What they found is that a God who would meet them in the midst of persecution, imprisonment, stonings, rejection. What they found is the richness and the depth and the strength of Christ, the grace of Christ that would sustain them. And they found a bigger faith because an old, shallow one was torn down. So maybe it's the bodyguard faith. Maybe it's the on-demand faith or on-demand God. We all have on-demand things everywhere, right? Turn on your TV, you can get anything on demand. Go to the drive-through, get anything on demand, right? And so sometimes we treat God that way, right? He's like the vending machine. God, I need this. And if I was God, I'm a decent person, so I would do for me what I think God should do for me. And so we get upset with God, and our expectations of God you're not doing because they're based upon an on-demand God. And God, if you've lived in faith for a while, you know that God doesn't work on demand, right? God waits hundreds of years to deliver his people from slavery, and he doesn't work on our time schedule. He's not on demand. And so, again, it's not sometimes when we're young, when we're little, when people tell us, hey, God's going to take care of you, and that's an okay thing. But as you mature, what does it mean for God to take care of you? Doesn't mean nothing bad's going to ever happen to you. It means God's going to take care of you through the storm sometimes. Or he's going to meet your needs, but he may not do it right now. He may lead you through some things, but he's going to take care of you. And so maybe that's one we need to get rid of. Maybe it's the boyfriend God or girlfriend God, depending on how that works. And what he meant by that was just that idea that I've got to feel all close and lovey-dovey to God. And if I don't have that mountaintop spiritual high feeling all the time, then something's wrong. Again, take you back to Psalm 22. Jesus didn't always feel close to God. Disciples of Jesus didn't always feel goosebumps and good all the time. In fact, it hurt a lot of times. There was times when they struggled, but that didn't mean God wasn't there. And so sometimes our expectations, well, if I don't feel like this, then something's wrong. But that's okay. Sometimes God tears that down, and there's things that we learn through the struggle. Maybe it's the guilt God needs to go. The God that when you think of God, you automatically feel guilty. Maybe it's that one. Maybe it's the anti-science God or the gap God, and those are different sermons for a different day. But those first few, though, I think are ones, especially for this topic. When we think about being disillusioned, oftentimes it is that sense in which, God, I am not safe, or God, I am not getting what I think I should have right now. And those are hard for us. And yet, as we tear them down, what we find is that God builds back something better. And so, sometimes it's letting go. It's our willingness to let go of old, shallow, or incomplete things. It says, God, maybe I've been seeing you wrong. And through the process of this, I want you to mature my faith. I want you to perfect my faith. I want you to draw character out of my life that's going to come because I've torn down an old thing, but that's not the end of the process. That's just the beginning. But now, God, I want you to build back. I want you to show me, and I want you to help me. And as we lean in, and sometimes when we hurt, though, what do? We lean away. Right? If something scares me, something hurts me, if something is difficult for me, I do it. I walk away from that, right? We've had a mouse issue, some of you knew, in the office, and we want to see people run fast. Watch Loretta Humphrey run away from a mouse. She's record-setting time, all right? And we run away from things that scare us and hurt us. We do that. And I did too. I ran after. I just don't want to admit it. And so I don't like them either. It's a happy day when you hear those traps snap and there's a dead mouse. So, but that's a side issue. But we run away from things that scare us and hurt us. And yet, what you find, I think the most helpful thing is not to run away, but to lean in to. Lean into God. Lean into where He's taking you. And again, that doesn't mean it's all happy and jolly and la-la and happy and good. It may be very, very painful, and I get that, and I don't want to diminish anything, but I would just take you back to where we started. In my Bible several years ago, I don't know where I'd seen it or heard it, but Psalm chapter 22, it's like 31, 33 verses. I'm not going to read it through all of it because it's too long for our purposes here, but what it is a series of paragraphs that alternate between anguish and trust. Anguish and trust. Anguish, trust. It keeps going back and forth from paragraph to paragraph as you read through that passage. And so when Jesus was crying out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? I think it was also it was a moment of pain. It was a moment of, oh, this is terrible. But I think it was also a moment of, this is the hardest thing I will ever endure, but I trust you. And so it's hard, but I trust you. And it hurts, but I trust you. And so you find David, my God, why have you forsaken me? Verse 3, though, is trust. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. God, this hurts, but I still believe. I still think you're sitting on the throne. And you, our fathers, put their trust. Lots of people before me have found strength and they have survived hard things because they believed that you were sitting on the throne. Verse 6, though, back to anguish. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by men and despised by the people. David was rejected. He was persecuted. He was going through hard things. But verse 9, back to trust. Yet you brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you, even in my younger days. Verse 12, many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan encircle me. Anguish. Verse 19, but you, O Lord, be not far off. O Lord, my strength, come quickly to help me. Back and forth it goes, anguish to trust. So I wish I could stand up and say, hey, here's the simple thing. Here's the thing that's going to tear down the old stuff and fix it tomorrow. It's not the way it usually works. But what I would like for you to be encouraged with today is to lean in. Is to lean in. And over these next few weeks, as we look at different topics along this idea of being disillusioned, I hope that you will lean in to God. You will lean into a helpful friend. You will lean into truth. And in doing so, what you'll find is that the old ways of thinking, old faith systems, old ways of looking at God, maybe they begin to fade away and they're replaced by richer, deeper, more intimate faith with God. And as you do so, I pray that you would find, as David did in the midst of his struggle, as Jesus did in the midst of his struggle, that you would find a faithful friend who walks with you and to tear things down in our life, not because he hates, not because he doesn't love, but because he wants better for us. And so that doesn't answer all of your questions. I get that. I know there are questions that you and I will never have answered this side of heaven. But I think there's a peace to be found as we lean into God, as we lean into what he has for us in our hard times. So disillusionment can either lead to greater faith, can lead to less faith, but I pray that you would lean in so that it produces a greater faith in your life and in my life. Let's pray together, please.